Welcome to the Craft of Coaching podcast, where we dive into what it truly takes to become a skilled, confident life coach. I'm your host, Kate, head of the CLCC, or Certified Life Coach Collective, an ICF-Accredited Level 1 coach training program. We combine courage, coaching, and community to offer you more than just a training program, but a life-changing experience where you use your own personal transformation as the learning ground for supporting your clients. On this podcast, we explore how you can use coaching skills to support your clients or expand your own growth, all grounded in evidence-based coaching practices. Learn more about our program and get free resources for becoming a life coach at teamclcc.com. And now, here's today's episode. All right, everybody. Hi, it's Kate. Buckle up, strap in, get ready, because today I'm going there. We're going to be talking about trauma-informed coaching. And the question has been asked. I have brought it up on other Craft of Coaching podcast episodes. Should coaches be working with clients who have trauma? What does the data say about the level of competence and skill that you need to properly support someone who is dealing with trauma? And so today I'll be talking about really what trauma is, what to be aware of if clients exhibit trauma, and how coaches can be trauma-informed without overstepping their role. And I've got a lot. I'm pulling from research as best I can find it, because with coaching still being a relatively newer industry, there's not a lot of research that takes, for instance, two different groups and gives one group a coaching methodology to help them with whatever they're struggling with, trauma, anything else, and another group with a traditional therapeutic method or, a placebo where they just kind of say, do your best and let's compare these two groups and see how one does versus the other and all of that. And that is the backbone of the kind of clinical research that I draw from and take from. I come from an evidence-based place. It informs the instructional design of the Courageous Living Coach certification, all of that. So there is not a lot of really great clinical research out there, and I'm going to get into some of that today, but I think there are some valuable takeaways you'll be able to have around trauma-informed coaching, some things you definitely want to be aware of as a coach. Do not skip these. Do not pass go. Like literally, do not sleep on this, and we'll get into all of that today. So, first things first, I can't help but want to say how amazing that you, the person listening to this, are either interested in coaching or you already are a coach. And thank goodness for that. And I want to say that because this being a human thing, as we all know, is really hard. And I thank you for your interest in coaching or being a coach, because as a coach, you're naturally drawn to this profession from a place of empathy, from a desire to help others, from your own self-awareness after having gone through difficult or challenging journeys. Like there's a heart-centered place where you have a desire to take that and try to say, okay, what I've walked through, what I've seen others walk through, the lessons learned along the way, I have a desire to try to do something good in the world as a result of that. And that's the first thing I really wanted to say, because I've been looking at all of this research into trauma, and it's like, it just really hit me. It is a hard thing being a human. It's just hard. So thank God we're not doing it alone. Thank goodness that people like you are curious about the human experience and supporting people through the human experience. So just a thank you for that. So the first place I wanted to start today is talking about what it would look like if someone is actively experiencing trauma. The reality is that all humans experience at some point something in their lives that could be considered trauma. You don't have to have survived a war or been in physical danger, and I think it is a great thing that trauma is being talked about as part of everyday life. I think it's not as great that sometimes, as part of their marketing, coaches are going onto social media and essentially telling people, here are the signs that you have trauma. And then, it's like a little YouTube video or, something like that. And it's like, hold on. If you don't know the context of the largely anonymous audiences who will be listening to what you have to say and interpreting it in their own way, and then trying to cope with essentially a self-diagnosis of trauma, that is worrisome to me. And so I think that something I continually try to keep in mind whenever I'm talking about things on social media, something I'm encouraging people to keep in mind in the coaching industry, is that we really need to be mindful of the fact that for us, dropping something on social media about like, here's how you might be aware that this is something you're struggling with. For us, having done the research and worked with the clients and seen the transformation that can happen as someone moves from point A to point B, we are not going to be as activated. And there could be people reading, watching, consuming your content who find it very overwhelming to have a kind of whoa moment when they're just scrolling online of, oh, wait, do I have this big problem? They might feel stigmatized. I mean, there's just a lot of unknowns. And I really want to emphasize the fact that while I understand that coaches are wanting to market themselves and say, hey, here's what I know, and I want to make it clear to my potential audience who could be a good fit to coach with me that I know what I'm talking about, that I'm aware of what the problems are that they're facing, you need to be aware that when it comes to trauma, especially people who are actively triggered or people who have acute trauma, it might not be the healthiest thing for them to consume. So it's something really worth considering. People who are traumatized, a couple of things that tend to show up. And so I'm coming from an educational lens for coaches, for you to consider these things. And my favorite resource online for you to dig into it deeper is PubMed. It's National Institutes of Health. You can search for so many things. And I'm a complete nerd and love researching and learning and all of that. So you certainly can check all of this out to get more resources and more information. But if you have a client who is actively traumatized, some of what's going on behind the scenes that you can't see is that they probably have an activated amygdala. And the amygdala is a part of the brain that's fear sensing. It's a part of the brain that's going to go on high alert if there's something to be worried about. And the tricky thing about trauma is that when someone is in a trauma state or their trauma is activated, they are going to have a highly activated amygdala, which means that they could be experiencing something called hyperarousal or a feeling of being on edge. Having experienced hyperarousal before myself, having seen it in others, I would say the closest thing I can say to what hyperarousal is like is there's kind of two physical experiences I've had that I would say are close to hyperarousal. One is just kind of having too much caffeine, which, if you've ever had that experience, you feel kind of nuts, your heart might be racing, you might be kind of sweaty, you just feel kind of, the other that I've experienced is being so tired. I don't know if other people can relate to this. I remember this when my kid was a newborn. It was like being so exhausted and tired, but like weirdly wired at the same time. And I just remember times when I woke up in the middle of the night to feed my daughter when she was a newborn, and then trying to go back to sleep and just feeling like every little creak in the house. I was so exhausted, but like any tiny little creak in the house could just wake me up, and like I'd kind of jolt awake as if I had heard my daughter crying. So that would be the closest that I've come to that kind of like really strong hyperarousal. And sometimes when people have active trauma, it's even more intense than that. It can show up as being easily saddened. It can also show up as irritability, anger, extreme restlessness, inability to concentrate, startled easily by sounds, overwhelmed by sensory input. And usually when a client of yours, if they are struggling with trauma, if you are worried that they are in a traumatic state that is activated and they could harm themselves, Big thing that I always encourage for coaches, and I'll touch on that here today, is having someone who you can refer out to. That is really important as a coach to know who, if I have a client in crisis, here's who I'll refer out to. Some information you might want to ask about for your clients is, what is your somatic feeling? Like if a client comes to you and you're worried that they could be in a trauma state, asking questions about being easily saddened, irritability, anger, restlessness, concentration, startled easily, getting overwhelmed. You might also want to ask questions about if they're struggling with rumination about the traumatic event. That's one thing that can come up. Completely at the opposite end of the spectrum, you could get someone who has an abnormally calm reaction to what would normally be a traumatic event. So you get a client on the phone, they tell you something like, my dad died by suicide last night. And then they're like, but what I really want to talk about today is, some work deadlines. It's like, hold on a minute. Obviously, you don't want to force clients to talk about things they're not equipped to talk about, but that would be a pretty big red flag for me if something really intense had just happened for a client, but they didn't want to talk about it at all. And of course, people who are experiencing trauma will want to avoid triggers that could reactivate the trauma because the trauma can feel really intense. The somatic experience of the trauma can feel really intense. So these are all some signs that someone could be walking through a trauma state. Now, here's my personal belief. People have different beliefs about this. I personally believe, so there's been a rise of trauma coaches. I believe that if someone wants to be a trauma coach, they are saying, this is what I want to do as a coach. I want to help clients who have trauma. It's my personal belief that that coach needs to be under the supervision of a licensed mental health professional at all times when working with clients. And my rationale for that is borne out by the research into how coaches or those who are in what is called non-specialized provider or non-specialized practitioner or lay person roles deliver interventions to people who have experienced trauma. And I will be getting into that research today. So if you are someone who wants to be a trauma coach or you are a trauma coach and you are not actively supervised by a licensed mental health professional, if you disagree with the idea that you need the supervision, then I would say, hey, listen to this episode, hear me out, take what you like, leave the rest. It is up to you. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is that the client's best interests are kept front and center. And as long as you're doing that and you feel like you're doing that, you'll make the choice that is the best choice for you and for your clients. I also want to make sure that I speak into the fact that I don't think that coaches should necessarily try to screen for trauma and weed out working with any potential clients who have had trauma, because coaching is so supportive, so helpful, so needed. And the reality is that every single client you ever work with will have experienced some kind of trauma. I'm sitting here right now and I'm telling you I've experienced trauma. It's not about how do I as a coach weed out those who have and haven't had trauma, since everyone has had trauma. It's more about how do we make sure that we are operating responsibly. And additionally, I really think coaching, and I wish that there was more organizational support, more cooperation between organizations in coaching and the Board of Behavioral Sciences in the United States and whatever those organizations would be that license mental health professionals in other countries. I wish that there was coordination between the coaching and therapeutic industries, because here are some truths about getting mental health support and why coaching should really, I think, be more aligned with getting that mental health support. And the first one is that, quite simply, there are not enough licensed mental health professionals to help everyone who needs care. Like, this is an acknowledged fact. The American Counseling Association states that there's a shortage of mental health providers. It would be fantastic if coaching could fill that gap, if coaching could The metaphor I've used in the past is I see coaching as, what if coaching could be like the general practitioners of healthcare, give you your health and nutrition advice, take your blood pressure, administer vaccines and basic medications. And then what if therapy was like surgery? Specialists, like, this is where you go when it's like, okay, things have gotten really, really serious and this person needs more specialized care. I would love it if the coaching and therapy industries would operate on that level, but currently they don't. So we are where we are. The second thing is that there are economic barriers to receiving care for a lot of people. Certainly, I'm sure we have all seen the coaches who charge like $5,000 for 5 sessions or something like that. Most coaches don't charge that. I don't, for instance. So for someone who does not have therapy covered by insurance, coaching is a viable alternative. There also could be people, I'm talking about accessibility really here. There also could be people who live in more rural areas and commuting to go to therapy just isn't even an option. Now, therapy delivered via telehealth or remotely is an option for most people these days. The practice actually started to try to scale. The practice of telehealth actually started as an attempt to try to scale delivery of therapy to veterans experiencing PTSD after the Vietnam War. But it is still not as common as an in-office therapy practice. So most coaches that I know are operating remotely. That could be a great way to improve accessibility for people who don't live where they can access therapy regularly. Third thing, stigmatization. And that is one of the big reasons why people wouldn't seek therapy. They might not want the label. They might not want the diagnosis, especially if it could follow them around in their medical record. And for those of you who don't remember life pre-Obamacare, I'm here to tell you I do. Obamacare, or really the policies that came out of the Obama administration surrounding healthcare, were set in such a way that healthcare providers can no longer deny you for insurance based on a previous diagnosis, which is fantastic because, who hasn't had a previous diagnosis of some kind, right? And one of the things that would happen at that point, prior to those policy changes was, if you were applying for insurance, they would ask you all these questions like, have you ever had a headache? And if you said yes to that, they could deny you for insurance for a headache so people might go, well, just lie about it. Just say, no, I don't get headaches. I don't get headaches. Well, then you had situations where there were people who had lied about symptoms they had experienced when applying for insurance because they knew they'd be denied if they didn't lie, and they were accepted for insurance. And then if they had a condition later and the insurance company didn't want to pay for the treatment for that condition, like let's say the person got cancer, they would go through that person's medical record and like dig up old medical records and things like that and find the time 15 years ago when somebody had a migraine, and then they go, well, now we're not going to pay for your cancer treatment because you lied on your insurance records. Clearly you said you never had a headache and you did have a migraine 15 years ago. And then they would not pay for the treatments. This is a real thing that was happening to people in the United States all the time. If you live in a country with universal health care, I applaud you. I envy you. But the result of that is that there are people who would not want necessarily to have therapy or having seen a therapist on their medical record because they wouldn't want that to follow them around, get them denied for insurance. And while the law has changed in the United States, if you just read up on some of the attacks on those healthcare changes that were made, that law could be reversed. And that's a scary thing to think about. There's also the fact that coaching as on a whole tends to be more focused on goals and forward momentum than therapy often is. It's also possible a client might have trouble finding a therapist willing to break away from a conventional model of therapy. So it is very clear, at least to me and from the research I've read, that coaches or Non-specialized practitioners, NSPs is what they're called, or lay people with proper training can provide support for someone who has experienced trauma. If it's extreme trauma, that person needs the full support of a therapist. But again, because all of us have experienced some level of trauma in our lives and as part of the human experience, whether that trauma is in the form of betrayal by someone we trust, or physical or mental abuse, or simply the trauma of going through an adverse event such as poverty or a natural disaster or a car accident. Life is gonna life, as the kids say. And I think we need everyone who can offer support to offer that support. And since every client you ever work with will have experienced some kind of trauma, let's get into how coaches can operate from a trauma-informed lens and bring trauma-informed practices into their coaching. And we're going to start with the research. So when it comes to research, finding sources specifically on life coaching and the efficacy of life coaching interventions when applied by life coaches is somewhat difficult. Most of the time, I hope anyway, coaches are being trained in evidence-based practices that come from the clinical therapeutic research. In the Courageous Living Coach certification, that's what we're doing. We're looking at what the research says on best practices for coaching, for behavior change, for performance improvements, and then we go, okay, how do we put that into the backbone of the training that we provide? So, as I was doing research for this episode, I was thrilled when I found the International Coaching Psychology Review, which is a journal online that appears to approach coaching through a more formalized, evidence-based lens. There were a couple things in at least one of the articles that I reviewed on coaching and trauma that had me raise my eyebrows a little bit. I found an article called Restoring Meaning and Wholeness, The Role for Coaching After Trauma, September 2012, by Tehrani et al. And starts out as a solid article. The article lays out what trauma is. I thought it was fantastic that the article asked the question, when are coaches competent enough to help people who have gone through a traumatic event? Personally, I found their answer to be a little too quick to assert that coaching is an effective intervention. The article even asserted that coaching might be quote unquote better than counseling for helping with trauma, which raised my eyebrow a bit. I did not see any clinical data backing up that claim. So when I look at a research source, I have a bachelor's in sociology, I have a master's in psychology, so I have written God knows how many papers and things like that. And, one of the things they teach you in school when you're looking at in any of the sciences is, okay, is there data to back up the claim, and what's the quality of the data to back up the claim? What's the sample size? Are you making a claim based on a sample size of 2 people? Because 2 people probably is not representative of the whole population, things like that. In this case, there was no data backing up a claim that coaching would be better than counseling for treating trauma. Not evidence. There were justifications and arguments made for that, but not evidence. So for instance, for a claim like that, I would hope to and expect to see research studies that compare coaching interventions with, say, traditional counseling interventions among a population that had been assessed by the researchers to determine, okay, we're going to take these 2 populations that are struggling with the same things. We're going to do a pre-assessment. We're going to do a post-assessment. We're going to deliver to one of these groups the coaching intervention and another the traditional counseling intervention. We're going to measure the changes in what those populations are experiencing based on the intervention that they received. And we're going to see, do we see more of an improvement in one versus the other? Or is it about the same? Or, we'll essentially run the experiment. Another thing that raised my eyebrow a bit was that this article advises coaches to undertake a trauma assessment prior to working with clients on trauma. And this is where things get sticky. Because one of the factors that the Board of Behavioral Sciences would probably evaluate, and I'm coming from a US-based perspective, I think it's probably true in other countries as well, But one of the factors that would probably be evaluated if the Board of Behavioral Sciences thought someone was trying to practice therapy without a license would be, is this practitioner trying to conduct assessments or evaluate diagnostic criteria for a client? So for coaches who want to practice trauma coaching, I think it's a best practice to have concurrent training and administering these pre and post assessments for your clients, and to make sure that the Board of Behavioral Sciences or whomever governs mental health licensing where you live will not see that as a sign that you are trying to practice therapy without a license. You've been warned. So there's another reality that has to be faced in that training and coaching simply cannot compare to the years of schoolwork, the thousands of hours of experience that a therapist has in clinical environments under supervision and with access to likely a university network as well as a therapist network of colleagues to consult with if a client exhibits behaviors requiring an extreme intervention. Additionally, I didn't see this acknowledged so much. I go, what about compassion fatigue? Or what about vicarious traumatization of the coach themselves? I know of 2 different life coaches this is in my total career, who have had clients die by suicide. So we're talking hundreds of clients, thousands of coaching hours. I know of 2, okay? So it's not a common experience, but both times and in both cases, the coaches themselves were absolutely gutted by what happened and felt incredible guilt, which is very common in the wake of someone dying by suicide, that they hadn't realized that the clients they were working with were struggling to that degree. So that's another thing that I don't see this article addressing. I also wonder about, what about secondary or vicarious trauma? If the way that a client is trying to process their trauma is to give you, the coach, a detailed description of sexual assault, torture, witnessing a murder, what if you, the coach, are unexpectedly thrown into your own trauma response as a result of hearing these accounts? So I wonder, do you as a coach have adequate support yourself? And if you as a coach went into a trauma response and could not support that client, what then? So these are the concerns that I have. Now, the article does state, it is important for the coach to recognize the limits to their knowledge and competence in dealing with some of the deeper issues which may be present in a client experiencing significant levels of trauma symptoms, or where the traumatic events are complex or go back to early life abuse or losses. Coaches should also recognize that in order for them to work effectively with a client, there has to be a reasonable level of self-awareness and willingness to work on those activities which will reduce their anxiety and levels of arousal. And for as much as this article did raise some eyebrows for me, I was glad that they came back to this thread, which I saw again and again. You'll hear that today in the research I did on how equipped are laypersons, coaches, non-specialized practitioners to deliver trauma-based interventions. And that thread is supervision, supervision, supervision. So this is also from the article by Tarani et al. And it states, working with trauma, perhaps more than any other form of coaching, requires that the coach be supervised by someone aware of the dangers in undertaking this kind of work. It is likely that this will be a coaching supervisor with qualifications in clinical or counseling psychology. The article also states, before engaging in this kind of work with coaches, should find a coaching supervisor who is qualified in clinical or counseling psychology and has experience in dealing with trauma. However, the coach should also take personal responsibility for themselves and their need to build their emotional resilience and emotional resources. So, even this article that's making this claim that I don't see backed up necessarily, making a claim though, that coaching could be a better intervention than therapy, traditional therapy for trauma, even this article is saying you need to be supervised by someone. And the thing that I would say really had me go, about this article more than anything is that this article, which is purportedly published in a journal in an attempt to align with some kind of academic standard, ends with a plug for a training program that is run by one of the authors of the article. Usually that's considered a conflict of interest in academic research. So there's that. Now, I have another article that I thought was really interesting. Let's get into this one. This one was truly validated. The title is An Open Label Pilot Study of a Brief Psychosocial Intervention for Disaster and Trauma Survivors. It was by O'Donnell et al., published in 2020. So, summarizing a little bit from that article by O'Donnell and others, we know that after a disaster, people often experience trauma. We also know that the earlier that we address trauma, the more likely someone is to recover from it. Because we don't have enough mental health professionals, or because there can be barriers to significant therapeutic work over the long term, like after a major natural disaster, there's not likely to be availability for months of therapy to help someone recover. We need something that we can deploy quickly. And because we know that the earlier we deliver some kind of intervention, the more likely someone is to recover, that has led the World Health Organization and other psychological organizations to develop protocols, these brief interventions that can be delivered by everyday people who have not been trained to deliver those interventions necessarily. They might have some prior schema, like if they're a community mental health worker or a community health worker, things like that. But essentially, O'Donnell and others write that recognizing the gap in scalable, simple interventions that cater for the psychosocial needs of disaster and trauma survivors experiencing adjustment and subclinical mental health problems, an international group of experts was assembled to develop a new intervention, the Skills for Life Adjustment and Resilience Program. They call that SOLAR. And they go on to state that the SOLAR practitioners receive a 2-day training and are termed coaches within that program. And once again, this is the theme for coaches, for laypersons, for NSPs, non-specialized practitioners, and I quote, "Supervision of the coaches is offered weekly, recognizing the critical role of ongoing supervision for developing the skill base of non-mental health specialists. Supervision also assists with the identification of participants requiring more intensive or specialized treatment consistent with a stepped care approach. The supervision schedule may be varied once the coach completes the program with at least 2 participants and is regarded as competent by the supervisor. Each SOLAR session runs for 50 minutes with the exception of the first 80-minute session. Sessions are delivered to participants face-to-face on a weekly basis and can be provided at any easily accessible location in the community. Skills that the SOLAR Development Group prioritized for early gain are front-loaded to avoid participants missing this information in the event of subsequent non-attendance or attrition, which is common in transient disaster populations. Maintenance of skill development beyond each session is promoted through practice tasks, which the participant completes between sessions. Each session also includes revision of the skills taught previously. Participants are given a workbook summarizing the content delivered in each session, which provides a clear rationale for undertaking practice tasks. All right, so here we are. We have a study that has assessed how effective interventions could be delivered from non-professionals. They developed this program they call the SOLAR program. Turns out that it's effective. This is all a big yay. This is all a big hell yeah for the people who need this. And once again, coaches can play a valuable role in delivery of effective care. But with this study, if you look it up and look how it was set up, multiple psychological assessments were first conducted on the participants, the practitioners being trained, before they were even allowed to become SOLAR practitioners. Life coaches that I have ever heard of are not subject to any kind of assessment prior to starting life coach training programs, or during them, or after them. We have to take into account the facts of how these mental health programs are run. You don't want to just grab a study and say, oh, in this study, they found that the everyday person can be trained to deliver trauma-related care. No, that's not how this was run. This program, Solar, O'Donnell et al., 2020, it was run with these assessments of the practitioners to even become a practitioner. We have to take into account that part of the success of the program is the fact that not only was there ongoing supervision for the practitioners once they were doing the work, but that to be a practitioner at all, there was an assessment to determine fit and suitability for the program. And that doesn't currently exist in the coaching industry. This program had a safety protocol that it followed, and it was this. Safety was determined by monitoring for adverse events and assessing symptom-measured trajectories from pre to post-intervention and at 3-month follow-up. And everybody listen, they use so many different assessments. They use the K-10. They use the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist from the DSM-5. They use the psychological outcomes profiles, all to assess functioning, meaning the practitioners were also subject to ongoing oversight to make sure that they were not becoming traumatized vicariously as a result of being practitioners. So again, supervision, supervision, supervision. That is a theme here. So I'm going to share about one more research article before I get into the specific and actionable ways that you as a coach can, even if you don't want to be a trauma coach, can bring a trauma-informed lens to your coaching practice. So this article is by Bryant et al., 2017, and the title is Effectiveness of a Brief Behavioral Intervention on Psychological Distress Among Women with a History of Gender-Based Violence in Urban Kenya, a Randomized Clinical Trial. So, same thing in this study. NSPs, or non-specialized providers or practitioners, are recruited to deliver interventions. All of the studies that I was looking at, all the research I was looking at, I was specifically trying to look at, okay, what do we have indicating that even if someone is not a licensed mental health professional, they still can be effective at bringing a safe, psychological, trauma-based intervention for other people. And this randomized clinical trial by Bryant et al. Was looking at how effective non-specialized providers, NSPs, are at delivering interventions. In this particular study, they used a behavioral treatment protocol called Problem Management Plus, or PM Plus. PM Plus was originally developed by the World Health Organization, or WHO, and PM Plus is essentially strategies that people without qualifications or experience in mental health can be trained to deliver to reduce common mental disorders following adversity. So in this article by Bryant and others, practitioners allowed to participate were already community health workers. And that's worth stating because community health workers are already people trained in some level of traumatic awareness simply by virtue of the work they're doing every day, if not their actual training program. The trial that was looked at here also excluded some clients from participating. Clients. So people who would receive a trauma-based treatment. So there were clients who were excluded from participating, not allowed to participate if they had either A, imminent plans of suicide, B, psychotic disorders, or C, severe cognitive impairment. So assessors referred any cases where a client fell into one of those three buckets, any cases of threat or harm or self-harm, to local services. So once again, coaches, this is another example of the development of a solid, clinically validated intervention program to be offered by people who don't have specialized mental health training or a license to practice therapy. And in this environment, where they're saying, okay, let's take some people who don't have a license and don't have specialized training. We recognize that we need to pull out clients who would be too far on the trauma spectrum. We need to refer them out to those who do have specialized mental health training and a license. So again, if you are thinking about putting yourself out there as a trauma coach, and that is the population you want to work with, you need to remember that you don't have anyone out there in the real world of one-on-one coaching who's doing a formal assessment to determine whether or not a client you might be about to work with is experiencing these things. And as I said earlier in this podcast, if you as a coach, if you don't have a license and then you start trying to do any kind of diagnostic assessment, that puts you at risk of being considered someone who is trying to practice therapy without a license. So I want to, from a place of ethical care, just let coaches know that if you are planning to become a trauma coach, that you could be opening the doors to people coming to you who are really best served by a licensed mental health professional. The theme of supervision continues. Bryant and others write, quote, during the trial, clinical health workers received 2 hours of weekly supervision by the local supervisor who provided the supervision in 4 separate groups to the community health workers. So I just want to highlight again, these practitioners were supervised while they delivered interventions aimed at alleviating trauma. So again, coaches, are you supervised by a licensed mental health care professional who can help you and your client if you get in over your head? The outcomes here were good, which to me, again, if only I could wave a wand and the coaching industry and the therapeutic industries would work together. We could help so many more people, because the outcomes of the PM Plus protocol, 5 interventions, it's brief, it does show remarkable outcomes and help for women experiencing gender-based violence. And the practitioners themselves are okay. They're not reporting adverse outcomes. So this is great news. Yes, trauma-informed interventions and treatments can be delivered by quote-unquote everyday people who haven't necessarily done 10 years of education to get a bachelor's and a master's degree in clinical hours and licensure and supervision. But again, part of why this was successful was about how it was set up. And that includes checks and balances like practitioners being supervised. Most coaches are not supervised ever. So now you know what the research says, and you know that there are certain tools that need to be utilized. And namely, the data shows us that access to supervision is key if you want to be a trauma coach and open the doors to anyone who wants to process trauma to come your way. Separately, I think it's fantastic if all coaches, regardless of whether or not you want to be a quote-unquote trauma coach, at least bring a trauma-informed lens to coaching. So in today's podcast episode, at the start of the episode, I started by sharing some of the common ways that trauma will show up for your clients. And so your awareness of how trauma might show up in the first place is the first step so that you can recognize it as a coach. In the Courageous Living Coach Certification Program, we go a step further. We have an entire training module on how coaches can refer clients out if the client really needs more specialized help, including what to say to the client, what to have in place to make sure that your client will get ongoing support if you need to end the coaching relationship to refer them to a licensed mental health professional. This is the kind of training we give regardless of whether or not someone says, I want to be a trauma coach. This is the training we give to everyone. So what we can do as coaches is actually utilize the tools provided by Problem Management Plus or PM Plus with our clients on a regular basis, not even necessarily as a trauma intervention, but because there is some overlap between the tools of coaching and the tools that help with trauma recovery. So having said that, I'll just point out that the WHO's publication on Problem Management Plus reports varying levels of training for the non-specialized practitioners that participate in the program. But one thing that is in common, so they have different PM Plus programs being operated through different organizations throughout the world. But one thing that those programs all have in common is ongoing weekly supervision. Supervision is conducted by skilled mental health professionals who have received PM Plus training and have experience in its delivery. So let's take a look at the PM Plus protocol and look at how you can utilize that in your coaching sessions. There are 4 specific domains. Domain 1, stress management. Great. This is totally in the domain of coaching. This is techniques for mindfulness, minimizing stress, stress reduction. You could ask yourself as a coach, how am I incorporating stress reduction into my sessions on a regular basis? Am I aware of my client's stress levels and the tools my client is using on their own to reduce stress? Are the tools my client is using helpful? Is my client not using any tools at all to reduce stress? Domain 2, managing problems. And that is determining, is this problem solvable, unsolvable, or unimportant? Again, totally aligns with coaching. So in other words, contextualizing what is and is not within the locus of the client's control. And for things that are unimportant, using the cognitive strategy of redirecting your focus. Beautiful. Domain 3, they call it get going, keep doing. And that's about taking action, getting out of the inertia of depression and anxiety that so often comes with traumatic experiences and actively taking an action and trying to sustain those actions. Now, before I get to domain 4, if I may briefly editorialize, and I talked about this in another Craft of Coaching episode, talking about what's the best coaching style. There are a lot of people over the past several years who have gotten very divisive about treatment interventions or coaching approaches. And one of the ways that has shown up is in this, there's the somatic trauma-informed body-based camp, and then there's the cognitive behavioral action-based camp. And the body-based camp has a tendency to, at least on social media, talk very dismissively about cognitive strategies, action-based strategies, and this is folly. This is not what's borne out as the research. You as a human listening to this, me, any of us, I'm not different than anybody else, will respond to a wide range of different approaches. It's not that one approach is better than the other, it's that there are appropriate interventions at different times for different people, for different life contexts. So unfortunately, people are going to go onto social media and do what they do. But when you see someone who just craps all over the idea that strategically identifying problems and setting goals and deploying a cognitive intervention is bad or wrong, or it's outmoded, or it's outdated, or it's old school, and that a body-based approach, a somatic approach is inherently better, you should know that the clinical research does not bear that out. The clinical research shows that action-based strategies are valid approaches. And the Bryant et al. Article that I'm referring to right now actually referenced sources that studied problem-solving therapeutic approaches in high-income populations as well as low-income populations in South Africa, and in both populations, a problem-solving approach where you focus on what you can control and take action steps was effective. So I'm not interested in the war of my approach is better, or this is old school, or that's outdated. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in when people are suffering, how can we help? And the research shows that this helps. So as a coach, are you encouraging your clients to identify and cultivate somatic awareness as well as identify the problems they do and don't have control over? Are you encouraging them to take action? Are you encouraging them to make that action consistent over time? Now let's get into the 4th domain. The last part of PM Plus was to strengthen social support. This is such a great area for coaching because not only does the coaching provide social support, like sitting with someone who's listening to you and asking targeted, focused questions about your life is a form of social support, but also as coaches, we need to be aware of the kind of social support our clients have in their lives, since it's such a huge predictor of the client's overall satisfaction in life. There are numerous clinical studies showing that social support is key for well-being. I really loved Johann Hari's book, Lost Connections. The title is Lost Connections. And it points to a lot of research that, in fact, depression and anxiety are less linked to low serotonin levels, which is what we were believing since the 1990s, and more so linked to low social support. When people have high levels of social support, they tend to be less depressed or anxious overall. That does not mean that I am throwing out the research showing that there's a tendency for there to be lower serotonin levels or dopamine levels, any of those things. It means that I'm saying we don't need to just approach trauma, depression, anxiety as the offshoots of trauma from a purely biochemical model. In fact, the 4 domains that problem management is coming from here, notice that none of them are biochemical alone. These are all things that will support someone's healthy biochemistry, but they're not biochemical interventions alone. So this social support domain is an important one, and an action step for you as a coach would be to consider the general pattern of your coaching sessions and ask yourself, are you aware of these 4 domains for your client? Is stress reduction a regular part of the conversation? What about focusing on the problems you can control and taking action? What about social support? And another action step after listening to today's episode, for you as a coach, regardless of the type of coaching that you want to focus on, if you aren't already connected to a mental health practitioner who does telehealth, I do recommend finding a connection to one immediately so that just in case you ever have a client who is in crisis, you have someone that you can call and refer out to. So I hope that today's episode clarified a little bit about the role of trauma in coaching, things you need to be aware of if you want to focus exclusively on trauma in your coaching practice, and ways that you can be a trauma-informed coach, even if you aren't going to focus on trauma, because that is how you provide the highest possible care for the people that you serve.